It was the autumn of 1864, a season that hung heavy over the fractured landscape of the American South. The Civil War was entering its final bloody throes, and deep in the hinterlands of Ware County, Georgia, the air was thick with the scent of pine resin and decaying swamp matter. This was a place where the map seemed to dissolve into the murky waters of the Okefenokee, a region largely untouched by the grand maneuvers of General Sherman's armies, yet suffocated by the phantom limb of a dying Confederacy. It was here, amidst the towering longleaf pines and the impenetrable silence of the marshlands, that a small detachment of Union scouts, the vanguard of the 4th Massachusetts Cavalry, stumbled upon an anomaly that would haunt their official reports and personal nightmares for decades to come. Sergeant Elias Thorne, a man whose soul had been hardened by 3 years of relentless skirmishes, led the patrol. They were miles off course, drifting through the gray mist that clung to the forest floor, searching for Confederate deserters or hidden supply caches. What they found instead was a dilapidated shack, hidden within a dense thicket of palmettos on the edge of an abandoned plantation. The main house of the estate had long since burned to the ground, a skeletal reminder of the war's reach, but this small structure remained, leaning precariously against the encroaching wilderness. To the untrained eye, it was nothing more than a ruin, a grave for forgotten farm tools. But as Thorne signaled his men to dismount, a sound cut through the humid air. A sound so alien to this primitive setting that it caused the soldiers to freeze, hands hovering over their carbine latches. It was a rhythmic, metallic clicking. Precise. Artificial. Deliberate. With weapons drawn, the scouts kicked open the rotting door, expecting to find a Confederate signal corpsman hiding in the gloom. The interior was dim, lit only by shafts of dusty sunlight, piercing through gaps in the cypress siding. But there was no soldier in gray inside. There was no military equipment, no standard-issue Beardsley telegraph, no heavy batteries hauled by mules. Instead, sitting on an overturned crate in the center of the room, was a young black boy. He could not have been more than 10 years old. He wore the tattered, coarse linen of a field hand, his frame slight and malnourished, a testament to the brutal deprivation of the times. Yet, it was not his appearance that stunned the hardened Union soldiers into silence. It was what lay before him on a rough-hewn table. It was a contraption of madness and genius, a working telegraph built entirely from the refuse of a collapsing society. The soldiers stepped closer, their boots crunching on the dirt floor, eyes widening in disbelief. The boy did not look up. His focus was absolute, his small, calloused fingers dancing over a key made not of polished brass, but of a flattened spoon and a rusted nail, tensioned by a strip of stiff leather. The wiring was a chaotic web of scavenged copper, likely stripped from stolen bells or broken machinery, insulated with dried pine pitch and wrapped in fraying twine. It connected to a crude battery system, a series of glass jars filled with acidic swamp water and zinc scraps that hummed with a faint, impossible energy. Sergeant Thorne lowered his weapon, his breath catching in his throat. He knew the sound of Morse code. He had heard it in the command tents of generals. But this was impossible. The boy was tapping out a message with a fluidity and speed that rivaled the most experienced operators in the Union Army. Dash, dot, dash, dash. The rhythm was flawless. The soldiers watched, mesmerized, as the boy stopped, his head tilting slightly to the side, his eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance, eyes that held a depth of knowledge far too ancient for his young face. They were not the eyes of a child playing a game. They were the eyes of a master craftsman engaging with the invisible currents of the world. Then came the moment that defied all logic. From a receiver fashioned out of a tin can and a coiled iron wire, a response came. Click, 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 click. It was faint, barely audible above the buzzing of the swamp flies, but it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was answering him. The boy nodded once, solemn and terrified, and began to tap a reply. The soldiers looked at one another, the hairs on their arms standing on end. There were no telegraph lines running into this swamp. The nearest Union outpost was 40 miles north. The nearest Confederate line was broken and retreating. Who was on the other end? How was this crude pile of scrap metal piercing the silence of the Georgia wilderness? In that shack, amidst the chaos of 1864, the laws of reality seemed to bend. This wasn't just ingenuity. This was a phenomenon that challenged the very fabric of their understanding, a silent signal echoing from the darkness of history. To truly grasp the magnitude of what those Union scouts found in that decaying shack in Ware County, we must first strip away the comfort of our modern perspective and step into the suffocating reality of 1864. We live in an age where connection is instant, where the world is woven together by invisible data streams that we take for granted. But to find such a concept manifesting in the deep, terrifying isolation of the Civil War-era South, constructed by the hands of a boy whom the law regarded as nothing more than chattel, is to confront a paradox that history struggles to explain. This isn't just a story about ingenuity or even the extraordinary circumstances of the American Civil War. This is a journey into the heart of an untold enigma, a testament to resilience, and perhaps a glimpse into the unseen forces that shaped lives under the brutal yoke of slavery. Consider for a moment the psychological architecture of the McAllister plantation. It was a place designed with a singular, cruel purpose: to crush the human spirit, to sever the bonds of community, and to erase any sense of individual agency. In such an environment, the very act of thinking, of dreaming beyond the cotton rows, was a radical rebellion. For a child like Elijah to not only dream, but to manifest a complex technological apparatus. From Refuse is an event that transcends mere intelligence. It suggests a profound, almost terrifying disconnect from the reality that sought to imprison him. Imagine the psychological toll of harboring such a mind in a world that forbade it to exist. Imagine the sheer will required to create something so advanced from nothing: scavenged copper, rusted iron, discarded rope, while living under the constant, looming threat of the overseer's lash. We are looking at a boy who, by all accounts, should not have known the principles of electricity, let alone the intricate syntax of Morse code. Yet, the records suggest he did not merely learn these things, he felt them. This narrative challenges us to look beyond the physical artifacts of the war, the muskets, the uniforms, the battle maps, and peer into the unseen currents that ran beneath the surface of the conflict. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the nature of genius and the spiritual reservoirs that oppressed people tapped into to survive. Was Elijah simply a savant, a biological anomaly? Or was he, as the whispers on the plantation suggested, attuned to a frequency that the rest of the world was too deaf to hear? As we peel back the layers of this forgotten chapter, we find ourselves walking a fine line between historical fact and metaphysical mystery. We are inviting you to join us as we unravel the chilling details of Elijah's life, a boy whose connection to the world seemed to extend far beyond the physical, challenging the very fabric of understanding in a time of profound injustice. His story is a mirror reflecting the wasted potential of millions, but also a beacon of a power that chains could not bind. It is a haunting reminder that even in the darkest, most silent corners of history, there were signals being sent, waiting for someone, anyone, to receive them. This investigation will take us from the sweltering heat of the Georgia swamps to the cold, clinical observations of confused doctors, and finally, to the electric hum of a wire that should not have worked. It is a story that demands to be heard, not just as a footnote of the Civil War, but as a testament to the indomitable nature of the human mind. If you find yourself drawn into this forgotten chapter of history, if you feel the pull of the mystery that surrounded young Elijah, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement is what allows us to dig deeper into these archives and bring these vital, untold stories to light. Now, let us turn the clock back further, to where this enigma began, long before the first wire was ever strung. To truly understand the anomaly that was Elijah, we must strip away the chaos of the war-torn 1860s and retreat a decade prior into the suffocating, sweltering heat of a Georgia summer in 1854. The setting is the McAllister Plantation, a sprawling, merciless expanse of land carved out of the Ware County wilderness. In the history books, places like this are reduced to statistics of cotton bales and profit margins. But for the human beings owned by Master Thomas McAllister, the plantation was a universe of absolute control and relentless survival. The air here was heavy, not just with the humidity that rose from the nearby swamps, clinging to the skin like a second layer of sweat, but with the palpable weight of despair. It was a place where time was measured not in hours, but in the grueling rhythm of the harvest and the crack of the overseer's whip. In this world, the birth of a child was a complex, heartbreaking event. It was the arrival of new life, yes, but also the arrival of new property, another soul shackled from the very first breath. It was in the dead of a moonless July night when the labor pains began. The slave quarters, a row of dilapidated wooden shacks that offered little protection from the elements, were silent, save for the droning chorus of cicadas and the distant, mournful hoot of an owl. Inside one of these cabins, illuminated only by the dying embers of a hearth fire and a single flickering tallow candle, a woman named Sarah fought to bring her child into the world. But the central figure in this room, the anchor around whom the anxiety and the hope revolved, was Mama Cora. Mama Cora was an institution unto herself. Ancient, with skin like cracked leather and hands that had pulled hundreds of babies from the womb and prepared just as many bodies for the grave, she was the plantation's midwife and spiritual matriarch. She carried the oral history of her people and a reputation for seeing things that others could not. Shadows that moved against the wind, omens in the flight of birds. To the enslaved community, she was a protector. To the overseers, she was a harmless relic. But on this night, Mama Cora was about to witness something that would shake her stoic resolve. Labor on the plantation was often quick and brutal, a necessity of a life that allowed for no recovery time. But this birth was different. The air in the cabin seemed to grow thin, charged with a strange, static energy that made the hair on Mama Cora's arms stand on end. When the child finally emerged, slick with blood and the fluids of life, the room braced for the piercing cry that signals a healthy set of lungs, a protest against the cold reality of the world. But there was no cry. There was no wail of distress. There was only a profound, unnatural silence. Panic flared in the mother's eyes, but Mama Cora did not move to strike the child to wake him, nor did she rush to clear his throat. She froze, her experienced hands trembling slightly as she held the boy up to the dim light. The boy, who would come to be known as Elijah, was not dead. He was breathing, his small chest rising and falling in a calm, rhythmic cadence that seemed entirely out of sync with the trauma of birth. But it was his eyes that stopped Mama Cora's heart in her chest. Most newborns gaze out into the world with unfocused, milky confusion, their vision blurring the lines of a reality they cannot yet comprehend. Elijah's eyes were wide open, dark and terrifyingly clear. They did not dart around the room seeking his mother's face. Instead, they fixed upon a point in the middle distance, staring with an intensity that was impossible for an infant. It was a gaze devoid of innocence, stripped of the blank slate that nature grants the newborn. It was a look of recognition. Mama Cora, a woman who had looked into the eyes of the dying and seen the peace of the beyond, felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the night air. She felt as though she was holding something ancient, a vessel that had arrived already full of memories that did not belong to it. The stillness of the child was heavy, magnetic. It felt as if he was listening to a sound that was vibrating just beyond the range of human hearing, tuning into a frequency that permeated the wooden walls of the shack. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to stretch toward him, acknowledging a presence that commanded attention. Slowly, Mama Cora lowered the child into the crook of her arm, wrapping him in a rough-spun cloth. She looked down at him, and for a fleeting second, the baby's gaze shifted, locking onto hers. In that exchange, the old midwife felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of vertigo, a sensation of falling into a deep, dark well of knowledge. She saw not the helplessness of a slave child, but a terrifying potential, a spark of something that could burn down the world they knew. Her voice, usually a rasp of iron and command, dropped to a whisper that barely disturbed the silence of the room. "This one," she breathed, the words heavy with a premonition that tasted like ash in her mouth. "This one ain't like the others." It wasn't a compliment, and it wasn't a curse. It was a statement of fact, tinged with a subtle tremor of fear and wonder. She knew, with the instinct of a woman who walked the line between worlds, that this child carried a secret burden. From the moment he drew his first breath, Elijah was already connected to something else, something unseen, a passenger on a wavelength that would one day manifest in copper wire and scrap metal, but for now resided solely in a gaze that was far, far too old. On the McAllister plantation, amidst the oppressive, suffocating heat of the Georgia lowcountry, silence was a rare and often dangerous commodity. It was a world defined by the cacophony of labor, the rhythmic thud of the hoe, the crack of the whip, and the sorrowful cadences of field hollers rising from the cotton rows. Yet, in the cramped, drafty cabin where Elijah spent his first years, silence was the defining characteristic of his existence. Unlike the other infants born into the crushing weight of bondage, who announced their hunger and discomfort with wails that echoed through the quarters, Elijah possessed an unnatural quietude. He did not cry. He did not fuss. Instead, he lay in his woven basket with a stillness that bordered on the catatonic, his small body rigid, his eyes wide open and fixed on points in space that no one else could see. To his mother and the other women who took turns watching the children, this behavior was far more unsettling than any tantrum. They would often find him staring intensely at a blank corner of the ceiling, or tracking the movement of something invisible across the room, his head tilting slowly as if following a drifting feather. But there was nothing there. It was as if he was listening to a frequency that existed just below the threshold of human perception. The scuttling of a beetle inside the wall, the groan of timber settling in the master's house a quarter-mile away, or perhaps the very hum of the earth itself. Mama Cora, the midwife who had first sensed the anomaly of his birth, would watch him for hours, smoking her pipe, her brow furrowed. She told the others that the boy wasn't looking at nothing. He was listening to the whispers of the iron and the wood, a claim that sent shivers of superstitious dread through the community. As Elijah transitioned from a silent infant to a toddler, this passive observation evolved into a startling, tactile precocity. While other children played with sticks or mud, Elijah was drawn, with magnetic intensity, to the broken remnants of the plantation's machinery. The McAllister estate was littered with the detritus of agricultural industry: rusted plows, snapped wagon axles, and discarded tools. At the age of 3, an age when he should have barely grasped the concept of cause and effect, Elijah was found sitting in the dust by the blacksmith's shed, holding the shattered remains of a complex ratcheting mechanism used for hoisting grain. He wasn't playing, he was examining it. Witnesses later recalled, in hushed tones around the evening fires, how the boy's small, calloused fingers traced the fractured metal with the delicacy of a surgeon. He didn't just touch the object, he seemed to feel the history of its stress points. Without a word, and with no instruction, he picked up a jagged shard of slate and pressed it into a specific, hidden groove within the mechanism, temporarily restoring the tension in the spring. It was a repair that a grown man had failed to figure out days prior. He understood the internal logic of the machine, not through logic, but through feeling. He could sense where the flow of energy had been disrupted. This incident wasn't isolated. Soon, the enslaved community began to notice that Elijah would stop walking and point to a wagon wheel moments before it cracked, or cover his ears, seconds before a distant steam whistle blew from the railway miles away. This uncanny perception created a complex dynamic within the slave quarters. To some, Elijah was a figure of awe, a child touched by the divine, perhaps carrying the spirit of an ancestor who knew the secrets of the earth. To others, he was a source of profound fear. In a life where survival depended on flying under the radar, Elijah's strangeness was a beacon that could attract the wrong kind of attention. They whispered that he had the sight, or the ear, wondering if Mama Cora's initial premonition was a blessing or a curse. They realized that this child was not merely living in their world, he was decoding it, stripping away the surface reality to interact with the invisible vibrations of being that held their brutal universe together. The whispers that drifted from the slave quarters of the McAllister plantation were usually ignored by the big house, dismissed as the superstitious ramblings of an uneducated workforce. But in the spring of 1860, the rumors regarding young Elijah became impossible to ignore. Master Thomas McAllister was a man of cold pragmatism, a landowner who viewed the world through the lens of ledger balances and crop yields. He had no patience for mysticism. However, an incident involving his overseer, Silas Croft, forced a breach in his skepticism. Croft, a man known more for his brutality than his intellect, had been in a foul mood for weeks due to a prized silver pocket watch, a family heirloom, that had inexplicably stopped working. He had shaken it, cursed at it, and threatened to thrash the plantation blacksmith for failing to mend its delicate internal gears. It was during one of these tirades, under the baking Georgia sun, that Elijah, then barely 6 years old, stepped forward. The audacity of a slave child approaching a volatile overseer should have resulted in immediate punishment. Yet, there was something in Elijah's demeanor, a calm, trance-like focus that stayed Croft's hand. The boy didn't cower. He didn't ask for permission. He simply reached out, his small, calloused fingers hovering over the silver casing without actually touching the metal. He tilted his head, his eyes fixing on a point in the middle distance, as if listening to a frequency audible only to him. After a long, tense silence, Elijah pointed a trembling finger to a specific location on the back of the watch and whispered a single word: "Bent." When Croft, driven by a mix of anger and curiosity, later took the watch to a skilled horologist in Savannah, the jeweler was baffled. He confirmed that a tiny, microscopic escapement pin was indeed bent at the exact angle the boy had indicated, a defect completely invisible to the naked eye without a magnifying loupe. The accuracy was impossible. It was unnerving. And for Thomas McAllister, it was the moment the boy ceased to be a mere liability and became a subject of intense, calculating interest. Intrigued and sensing a potential that transcended the labor of the fields, McAllister summoned Dr. Alistair Finch from Savannah. Finch was a man of the Enlightenment, a physician and amateur scientist who prided himself on his rational understanding of the physical world. He arrived at the plantation with a leather satchel full of instruments and a mind fortified against what he called rural hysteria. He did not view Elijah as a child, nor even as a human being with a soul, but rather as a biological anomaly, a puzzle box to be unlocked. The examination took place in the plantation's library, a room smelling of old paper and stale tobacco, where the air was thick with dust motes and expectation. Finch sat at the heavy mahogany desk, arranging a series of tests he had prepared: a rusted sextant with a jammed arc, a music box that had played its last note years ago, and a complex clock mechanism with a stripped gear hidden deep within its bowels. Dr. Finch watched Elijah with a mixture of academic curiosity and thinly veiled suspicion, his fountain pen scratching furiously across his notebook. He noted the boy's physical condition: slight, underfed, with eyes that seemed too old for his face. But he missed the essence of what was happening. Elijah didn't tinker. He didn't use tools. He simply held the broken objects. To Elijah, the room wasn't silent. It was a cacophony of distress signals. The broken sextant screamed its misalignment. The music box wept its friction. He could feel the dissonance of the metal, the interruption in the flow of energy that the rest of the world ignored. With an almost lethargic grace, Elijah would tap a specific coordinate on the object, or press his thumb against a hidden latch, and the device would click, whir, or snap back into alignment. For Dr. Finch, this was a case of hyperacute tactile sensitivity, a neurological quirk that allowed the boy to feel vibrations others could not. He wrote pages about nerve endings and cranial pressure, trying to fit the miraculous into the sterile boxes of medical science. He hypothesized about savant syndrome, completely blind to the deeper, almost spiritual resonance of Elijah's perception. But Master McAllister, watching from the shadows of the room with a glass of bourbon in hand, saw something different. He didn't care about the medical diagnosis. He saw a resource. He saw a tool that could be exploited for profit, a parlor trick that could impress investors, or perhaps something even more utilitarian. As Finch packed away his instruments, muttering about fascinating deviations, McAllister was already calculating the worth of the boy's gift. He looked at Elijah not with wonder, but with the possessive gaze of a man who has found a diamond in the mud, completely unaware that the boy was not merely fixing machines, but listening to the weeping of a broken world. Generation failed. The seizure that had racked Elijah's small frame did not merely leave him frail. It stripped away the protective callus that guards the human mind from the infinite, chaotic noise of the universe. Where others saw a static landscape of pine forests and stagnant swamp water, Elijah now perceived a relentless, oscillating ocean of energy. The world had ceased to be solid. It was now a vibrant, terrifying tapestry of vibrations, a constant hum that vibrated in the marrow of his bones. He no longer needed to touch an object to understand its flaw. The flaw announced itself to him, singing a discordant note across the humid air of Ware County. This new reality was an assault on the senses. Consider the church bells of Waycross, miles away from the isolation of the McAllister plantation. To the field hands working the rows of cotton, the Sunday morning air was heavy and silent, save for the buzz of cicadas. But for Elijah, sitting motionless on the porch of the slave quarters, the ringing was a physical sensation. He would clamp his hands over his ears, rocking back and forth, grimacing in pain long before the wind carried the faintest, ghostly echo of a chime to the others. He felt the metal striking metal, The displacement of air, the concentric circles of sound rippling outward like stones cast into a pond. He was a human receiver, tuned to a frequency that no one else knew existed, forced to process the mechanical pulse of a world he had never been allowed to explore. Then there was the incident of the wagon wheel, a moment that cemented the community's fear of the boy. It happened on a Tuesday, under a sky bleached white by the relentless Georgia sun. Elijah was sitting by the pump house, his eyes glazed over, staring at a patch of weeds. Suddenly, he flinched, a violent, spasmodic jerk, as if he had been struck by an invisible whip. He let out a sharp cry, clutching his chest, his breathing ragged. The other enslaved workers paused, wiping sweat from their brows, looking around in confusion. There was nothing there. No overseer, no snake, no falling branch. Yet Elijah pointed a trembling finger toward the old logging road that snaked through the northern woods, whispering, "Broken. It snapped. The iron is screaming." 2 hours later, the plantation supply wagon limped back into view, the rear axle shattered, the iron rim of the wheel twisted and snapped exactly as Elijah had mimed. The vibration of that fracture, the precise moment the wood gave way under the load, had traveled through the compacted earth, a tremor too faint for any instrument of the era to detect. But to Elijah, it was a thunderclap. But the mechanical world was manageable compared to the human one. This was the most harrowing aspect of his sharpened perception, the ability to sense the unspoken. Anxiety, fear, and suppressed rage were no longer abstract emotions to him. They were tangible disruptions in the air, heavy and suffocating, like the approach of a thunderstorm. When Mr. Silas Croft, the overseer, rode past on his horse, Elijah would shrink away not out of submission, but because the man's volatile temper radiated a jagged, stinging heat that made the boy's skin crawl. He could feel the collective sorrow of the quarters at night, a low-frequency hum of despair that made sleep impossible. He was drowning in the psychic output of those around him, a silent witness to the internal wars waged behind the eyes of every person on the plantation. His behavior grew increasingly erratic to the outside observer. He began to track these invisible signals across the fields, his head turning slowly to follow the flight path of a sound no one else could hear, his eyes focused on an invisible plane. To the others, he looked like he was conversing with ghosts. The enslaved community, deeply spiritual and superstitious, regarded him with a mixture of profound awe and deep, unsettling unease. They stopped whispering when he was near, fearing he could pluck the secrets from their very thoughts. Mama Cora, the only one who dared to stay close, often found him in the dust behind the kitchen house. He would be tracing complex, frantic patterns in the red Georgia clay, swirls, jagged peaks, and long, rhythmic waves. She would watch him, her heart aching, as his small finger moved with obsessive precision, trying to give physical form to the invisible symphony that tormented him. He was trying to map the noise. He was trying to write down the language of the wind, the earth, and the metal. It was the desperate act of a silent child, wrestling with an overwhelming flood of information, a lonely genius trapped in a time and place that had no vocabulary for what he was experiencing. Elijah was not mad. He was merely listening to the raw, unpolished code of the universe, waiting for the means to answer back. By the late months of 1863, the atmosphere on the McAllister plantation had shifted from one of routine oppression to a palpable, vibrating tension. Elijah's evolution was no longer a quiet curiosity. It had become an intrusive phenomenon that demanded attention. The boy had ceased to be merely strange and had become something far more unsettling, a barometer for events that had not yet occurred. It started with the weather, a trivial thing to some, but vital in an economy built on cotton and soil. On days when the sky was a perfect, scorching blue, Elijah would stop his work, his small body going rigid, and he would begin to tap a frantic, erratic rhythm against the side of the barn. Within hours, the skies would darken, and a deluge would drown the fields. He wasn't guessing. He was feeling the drop in barometric pressure, the shift in the electrical charge of the air, long before the clouds gathered. But the predictions soon grew more personal and infinitely more dangerous. There were moments when he would stare down the long, dusty road leading to the main gate, his fingers twitching in a steady, marching cadence. Hours later, a specific traveler, a merchant, a tax collector, a courier, would crest the hill. He perceived the vibration of hoofbeats through the earth miles before they were audible to the human ear. Yet, the most terrifying manifestation of his gift involved the other enslaved people. One evening, a field hand named Isaac was silently planning an escape. He had told no one, burying his intention deep within his heart to avoid betrayal. Yet, as Isaac sat by the fire, Elijah approached him, his eyes wide and watery, and tapped a slow, mournful beat on Isaac's knee, a rhythm of capture and sorrow. Isaac fled that night and was caught by patrolmen before dawn. The plantation fell into a hushed, terrified silence. To the community, Elijah was no longer just a boy. He was a seer, a vessel of dangerous truths who could hear the racing heart of a man contemplating treason. This escalating strangeness inevitably drew the gaze of the spiritual authority of the region, Reverend Josiah Albright. Albright was a man carved from the harsh theology of the era, a fire and brimstone preacher who wielded scripture like a whip. He visited the McAllister estate frequently, his sermons always circling the same grim themes: obedience to the master as a reflection of obedience to God, and the divine retribution awaiting those who strayed from their station. He was a tall, gaunt man with eyes that seemed to burn with a cold, judgmental fever, and he viewed the spiritual hierarchy of the South as absolute. When rumors of the witch boy reached him, Albright did not see a medical anomaly or a savant. He saw a fissure in the divine order. During a Sunday service held in the open air, Albright's sermon was interrupted by a low, humming sound. It was Elijah, sitting in the dust, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that seemed to harmonize with the distant, unseen ringing of church bells in the next county. Albright stopped mid-sentence. He descended from his makeshift pulpit, his shadow falling long and heavy over the boy. He watched Elijah's fingers tracing invisible currents in the dirt, moving with a complexity that defied the mind of an uneducated child. The Reverend grabbed Elijah's hand, forcing it still, but even held tight, the boy's muscles twitched with a relentless, surging energy. Later that afternoon, in the cool, dim library of the manor house, Albright confronted Master Thomas McAllister. The conversation, recorded in part in the plantation's ledger under religious expenses, was chilling. Albright declared that Elijah's abilities were not gifts, but afflictions. "The devil," Albright intoned, his voice trembling with righteous fury, "needs no tongue to speak. He speaks through the gaps in a weak soul. This boy, he is a radio for the abyss." The Reverend argued that Elijah's connection to the unseen was a direct challenge to the authority of the church and the master. If a slave could know the future, if he could hear the unseen, he possessed power. And in the logic of the plantation, a slave with power was the ultimate heresy. Albright's fear was specific. He believed Elijah's signals would eventually incite rebellion. He warned McAllister that the boy was a lightning rod, and that the static he generated would eventually spark a fire that would consume them all. "He listens to voices that are not yours, Thomas, and not the Lord's," Albright warned, pacing the floor. "You must cleanse him, break the connection, silence the noise, or the noise will deafen us all." The demand was clear. Elijah was to be subjected to a spiritual and physical purification, a euphemism for torture designed to drive the spirits out. The boy was now caught in a terrifying pincer movement between the master who viewed him as a broken tool and the preacher who viewed him as a portal to hell. By the winter of 1864, the air in Georgia was thick not just with the humidity of the swamps, but with the suffocating weight of paranoia. General Sherman's forces were carving a path of destruction to the sea, and while the major battles felt distant to the isolated expanse of Ware County, the silence of the wires was deafening. Information had become the most valuable currency in the Confederacy, and on the McAllister plantation, the coffers were empty. The usual channels of communication, couriers, newspapers, and the telegraph lines that ran through the larger towns had disintegrated into rumor and hearsay. Master Thomas McAllister found himself ruling over a kingdom of uncertainty, his authority eroding with every day that passed, without news from the front. The plantation house, once a symbol of unshakable power, now felt like a fortress under siege by invisible ghosts. On this particular evening, a biting wind rattled the window panes, carrying the scent of pine and stagnant swamp water into the parlor, where McAllister sat with his overseer, Silas Croft. The room was dimly lit by a dying fire and a single kerosene lamp, casting long, distorted shadows against the peeling wallpaper. On the table between them lay a map of Georgia, its edges curled and stained with whiskey. Croft, a man whose brutality was usually matched only by his arrogance, looked haggard. He traced a calloused finger along the rail lines, muttering about supply chains and the impossibility of defending the perimeter with the few able-bodied men left in the county. They were discussing the unthinkable: evacuation. To leave meant admitting defeat. To stay meant risking everything on the hope that the Union Army would bypass their backwater holding. In the corner of the room, almost swallowed by the gloom, sat Elijah. He had been brought into the house not as a guest, but as a curiosity, and lately, as a servant for menial tasks that required small hands. He sat on a rough stool near the hearth, ostensibly there to tend the fire, but he had not moved to add a log in nearly an hour. In his lap rested a rusted iron pot, a piece of refuse from the kitchens that he had salvaged. To McAllister and Croft, he was part of the furniture, a silent witness whose presence was barely registered. But Elijah was not idle. His fingers, long and scarred from his scavenging, were dancing against the side of the metal pot. At first, the sound was nothing more than background noise, a rhythmic tink, tink, tink that blended with the popping of the firewood and the wind outside. It was easy to dismiss as the fidgeting of a bored child. But as the conversation between the two men grew more heated, debating the likelihood of a raid from the north, the rhythm changed. It became sharper, more deliberate. It ceased to be random noise and organized itself into a complex cadence of shorts and longs, a staccato language that mimicked the mechanical chatter of a telegraph key, though neither McAllister nor Croft possessed the knowledge to recognize the code. Elijah's eyes were squeezed shut, his head tilted slightly, as if he were listening to a frequency that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in the skull. Croft was the first to snap. The tension of the weeks prior had frayed his nerves to the breaking point. He slammed his hand onto the table, rattling the whiskey bottle, and turned to yell at the boy to stop the infernal racket. But the words died in his throat. The atmosphere in the room had shifted instantly. Elijah had stopped tapping. The sudden silence was louder than the noise had been. The boy opened his eyes. They were not the eyes of a subservient child. They were clear, focused, and terrifyingly devoid of fear. He looked past the overseer, past the walls of the house, staring fixedly toward the north. When he spoke, his voice was uncharacteristically loud, stripping away the vernacular expected of him, resonating with a chilling clarity. "They are coming," Elijah announced. The statement hung in the air, absolute and undeniable. McAllister, half rising from his chair, froze. Before he could demand an explanation, Elijah continued, his finger pointing vaguely through the north wall. 3 hours. Through the swamps, near the old mill. Not the road. The water. The specificity of the detail struck the men like a physical blow. This was not a vague premonition of doom. This was tactical intelligence. The old mill was a derelict structure miles away, accessible only by a treacherous, submerged path, known to few locals, and certainly no maps. For a Union scouting party to be navigating that route meant they were being guided, or they were desperate. The air in the parlor crackled with a sudden, primal fear, a terrifying blend of shock and the dawning realization that this 10-year-old boy had just intercepted a message from the ether. McAllister looked at the boy, then at the map, and back to the boy. The supernatural had collided violently with the brutal reality of war. There was no telegraph wire connected to the iron pot, no courier at the door, yet Elijah sat there, the echo of the warning still vibrating in the room, holding the lives of everyone on the plantation in his small, trembling hands. The 3 hours that followed Elijah's pronouncement were not measured in minutes, but in the agonizing, rhythmic thrum of anxiety that descended upon the main house of the McAllister plantation. Outside, the winter wind howled through the pines, a mournful sound that seemed to mock the stillness inside the parlor. Master Thomas McAllister stood by the window, his knuckles white as he gripped the sill, staring into the impenetrable darkness towards the north. Beside him, Silas Croft checked the priming on his pistol for the 3rd time, the metallic click echoing loudly in the silence. They were men accustomed to the tangible threats of plantation life, insubordination, disease, the fluctuating cotton markets, but they were entirely ill-equipped to handle the terror of a prophecy delivered by a child they considered property. The skepticism that had initially greeted Elijah's warning began to erode with every passing second, replaced by a creeping, superstitious dread. If the boy was wrong, he would be punished for his insolence. But if he was right, that possibility carried implications far more terrifying than a simple Union raid. It implied a breach in the natural order, a vulnerability that no amount of fences or overseers could secure. Then, exactly as the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the 3rd hour, a frantic shout rose from the perimeter guards. Through the driving rain and the mist that clung to the swamps, shapes emerged near the ruins of the old grist mill, blue coats, muddied and ghost-like in the gloom. It was a scouting party from the 104th Pennsylvania, just as the unseen currents had whispered to Elijah. They were disoriented, exhausted, and stumbling directly into the path Elijah had pointed out. The prediction was absolute. It was precise. And for Thomas McAllister, it was unforgivable. As the plantation guards scrambled to intercept the Union soldiers, driving them back into the tree line in a chaotic skirmish, McAllister did not feel the relief of a disaster averted. Instead, he felt a cold, hollow pit open in his stomach. He looked at Elijah, who sat motionless in the corner, his eyes still unfocused, tracking vibrations no one else could feel. In that moment, McAllister did not see a savior who had protected his land. He saw a dangerous anomaly, a living, breathing wiretap into a world that the master could not command. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The skirmish at the mill had barely ended when Reverend Josiah Albright stormed into the parlor, his face flushed with a terrifying mix of righteous indignation and genuine fear. To a man of his rigid theology, there was no room for scientific anomalies or inexplicable intuition. There was only God, and there was the devil. And since God, in Albright's twisted worldview, would never grant such power to an enslaved child, the source of Elijah's knowledge could only be demonic. "This is not a gift, Thomas," Albright bellowed, his voice shaking the rafters. "It is a possession. The boy is a vessel for the adversary. He speaks with tongues of iron and lightning." The Reverend demanded an immediate cleansing, a euphemism for a ritualistic breaking of the spirit to drive out the perceived evil. McAllister, desperate to restore his own sense of control, agreed. He needed to believe it was witchcraft. The alternative, that the boy possessed a superior intellect or a natural connection to the physical world that surpassed his own, was psychologically unbearable. Elijah was seized by Mr. Croft. There was no struggle. The boy's body was limp, his resistance entirely internal. They dragged him from the warmth of the main house, through the mud of the yard, to a dilapidated curing shed on the far edge of the property. It was a structure of rotting cypress and darkness, smelling of old tobacco and decay. Albright stood by, reciting psalms of binding and rebuke, as Croft threw Elijah onto the damp earth. But confinement was not enough to satisfy their fear. They needed to silence the source of the messages. Convinced that Elijah's tapping fingers were the conduit for this dark magic, McAllister ordered his hands bound. They used heavy, rough hemp rope, tying his wrists tight against his chest, restricting not just his movement, but his primary method of interacting with the world. The door was slammed shut and barred from the outside, plunging Elijah into absolute blackness. This was the silent punishment: total isolation, sensory deprivation, and the physical restraint of his gift. The intention was clear and cruel: to break the boy's mind, to force him to abandon the voices of the wires, and to bury the memory of that night under a shroud of trauma. McAllister wanted the other enslaved people to see that knowledge, especially knowledge that defied the master's understanding, resulted only in suffering. But as the heavy iron lock clicked into place, leaving Elijah alone in the cold dark, the irony was lost on his captors. They had bound his hands and walled him in, but they could not stop the air from vibrating. Even in the silence of the shed, the atmosphere hummed. The timber walls groaned with the shifting temperature. The distant thunder rolled through the ground, and deep within the boy's mind, the signals continued to flow, unbroken, unbidden, and louder than ever before. It is often said that silence is the loudest sound of all, but for Elijah, trapped within the rotting timber walls of the old curing shed on the edge of the McAllister property, there was no such thing as silence. The confinement, intended by Master McAllister and Reverend Albright to sever the boy's connection to the so-called demonic forces, had the exact opposite effect. Deprived of visual distractions and human interaction, Elijah's sensitivity to the invisible currents of the world did not atrophy, it metastasized. The damp, windowless space became an echo chamber, not for sound, but for the electromagnetic hum of a nation tearing itself apart. We know the chilling details of this period, not from oral history, but from a primary source that remained hidden for nearly half a century. In 1912, during the renovation of a medical estate in Savannah, a leather-bound journal was discovered beneath the floorboards of a study that once belonged to Dr. Alistair Finch. The pages, brittle with age and stained with ink and humidity, offer a window into a scientific mind grappling with the impossible. Finch, who had been tasked with monitoring the boy's physical condition during his isolation, began visiting the shed in secret, driven by a curiosity that bordered on obsession. His notes, scribbled in a frantic, jagged hand, document a transformation that defied medical explanation. An entry dated November 14, 1864, reads, "The boy does not sleep. He sits cross-legged in the center of the room, his head tilted, as if listening to a conversation occurring in the corner. But the room is empty. When I approach, he does not flinch. His pulse is slow, impossibly steady, yet his skin vibrates to the touch, like a telegraph wire under tension. He's not here. He is somewhere else entirely. Finch's observations grew increasingly erratic as the weeks passed. He noted that Elijah had begun to use his bare toes to trace intricate, labyrinthine patterns in the dirt floor of the shed. At first glance, they appeared to be the aimless doodles of a bored child. However, when Finch sketched these patterns into his notebook and analyzed them later, he realized they possessed a terrifying geometric consistency. They were not random, they were maps. But they were not maps of the plantation, nor of Georgia. Finch hesitantly speculated in a margin note, later heavily crossed out but still legible, that Elijah was transcribing a form of invisible script, perhaps plotting the trajectory of signals moving through the air, charting the unseen highways of energy that crisscrossed the atmosphere. While Elijah sat in the eye of this metaphysical storm, the world outside was descending into chaos. The war was no longer a distant rumor. It was a physical weight pressing down on Ware County. Master Thomas McAllister, once a man of iron discipline, was unraveling. The journal describes McAllister pacing the veranda at all hours, a loaded pistol in one hand and a bottle of whiskey in the other, muttering about spies and shadows. He had become convinced that Elijah was not just a conduit for evil spirits, but a beacon summoning the Union Army. The irony, of course, was that McAllister's paranoia was rooted in truth. Elijah was listening, and the Union was indeed coming. The breaking point arrived on a moonless night in late November. A Union raiding party, a splinter group from the main force moving toward the coast, struck the plantation's western perimeter. It was not a battle so much as a collapse. The sound of gunfire and the roar of flames consuming the cotton gin shattered the night. Panic swept through the slave quarters and the main house alike. In the confusion, the heavy padlock on the curing shed was struck by a stray bullet, or perhaps smashed by a fleeing overseer. History is unclear on the mechanism, but the result was freedom. Dr. Finch's final entry regarding the boy paints a haunting picture of that night. Amidst the screaming, the smoke, and the terrified stampede of livestock and people, Elijah stepped out of the shed. He did not run. He did not look for his mother, nor did he flee north toward the Union lines where freedom waited. According to Finch, who watched from the safety of the carriage house, Elijah stood perfectly still amidst the inferno, closing his eyes. He turned his head slowly, scanning the horizon like a radar dish, until he locked onto a specific direction, deep into the Okefenokee swamp. He was not escaping a master. He was answering a call, a specific, faint frequency, a silent, rhythmic pulse that only he could hear, was pulling him away from the world of men and into the desolate, watery unknown. With a strange sleepwalker's gait, the boy from Georgia walked away from the fire and the war, stepping into the darkness of the cypress trees, guided by the whispers of the wires that had not yet been built. The flight from the McAllister plantation was not a frantic dash for freedom in the traditional sense. While other runaways looked north, guided by the moss on the trees or the celestial map of the stars, Elijah was pulled sideways, deeper into the suffocating humidity of the Georgia interior. To the slave catchers and the bloodhounds, the trail went cold in the brackish, tea-colored waters of the Satilla River. But for Elijah, the path was illuminated by a sound only he could hear. It was a low-frequency thrum, a vibration that rattled his teeth and settled deep in the marrow of his bones. This was not the chaotic, jagged noise of human anxiety he had fled from, the screams of the overseer, the weeping of the separated families. This was steady, rhythmic, and metallic. It called to him from the heart of the desolate wetlands, a siren song composed of iron, rust, and magnetic fields. He arrived at his destination 3 days later, emaciated and covered in the black mud of the swamp. It was the skeletal remains of the forgotten Oakhaven foundry, a failed industrial experiment from the 1840s that had been swallowed by the encroaching wilderness. Vines strangled the brick chimneys, and Spanish moss draped over rusted boilers like funeral shrouds. Most would have seen a graveyard of industry, a place of rot, failure, and danger. Elijah saw a cathedral. He saw the raw anatomy of communication. He took shelter in a dilapidated overseer's shack, where the roof had partially collapsed, allowing the pale moonlight to illuminate his workbench, a rotting table he dragged from the mire. Here, the transformation began. The boy who had been labeled possessed, the child who tapped warnings on iron pots, became an engineer of the impossible. He did not have tools. He did not have blueprints. He possessed something far more potent, an innate, terrifying understanding of how things connected. He scavenged with the precision of a surgeon operating in the dark. A coil of copper wire, green with oxidation, was salvaged from the belly of a smashed generator half buried in the silt. Nails were pulled from rotting floorboards to serve as contacts, cleaned of their rust with sand and patience. A heavy cast iron latch became the key. He used dried river clay as an insulator and braided hemp twine found in the foundry's ruins to bind the structure together. Dr. Finch's notes, discovered decades later, speculated on this period with a trembling hand. He wrote of a savant-like comprehension of galvanic principles, but that clinical description failed to capture the spiritual dimension of Elijah's labor. Elijah wasn't just building a machine, he was exercising the noise in his head. Every twist of the wire, every connection made, silenced a fraction of the chaotic static that had plagued him since the trauma at the plantation. He was giving the invisible world a throat, a way to speak that didn't require his own mind to be the vessel. He worked with an obsessive, feverish intensity, ignoring hunger and thirst, driven by the whispers that guided his hands, telling him which wire held the current, which metal would sing. Yet, he was not entirely alone in that shack. As the days turned into weeks, and the device began to take the recognizable shape of a sounder and key, the atmosphere in the swamp shifted. The air around the shack grew heavy, charged with a static electricity that raised the hair on Elijah's arms, even when no storm was approaching. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long in the flickering candlelight. The local wildlife, the owls, the gators, the insects, fell silent whenever he touched the key. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath, or perhaps something ancient and unseen was leaning in, watching the boy manipulate forces that belonged to the storm and the sky. This presence was neither benevolent nor malevolent. It simply was. It was the observer of his solitude, a silent partner in the damp dark, manifesting as a faint, cold breeze that would ruffle the wires just before he made a connection. By late October, the device was finished. It was a grotesque, beautiful thing of scrap and desperation, sitting atop the rotting wood. Elijah sat before it, his thin fingers hovering over the crude key. The swamp outside was pitch black, the silence absolute. He didn't know Morse code, not formally. He had never seen a code book. But the rhythm was there, pulsing in the wire, waiting to be released. He pressed the key. Click. The sound was small, insignificant against the vastness of the Georgia wilderness, but to Elijah, and perhaps to the soldiers miles away who were about to stumble upon this impossibility, it was the loudest sound in the world. It was the first syllable of a conversation that shouldn't exist, a bridge built from the mud of slavery to the electric sky of the future.